Cool. Well, I want to welcome everyone to a presentation on the history of Austin housing cooperatives, presented by Henrik Tucker. This is a part of the Austin Cooperative Business Association's kind of training program and education program. My name is Ryan Nill. I'm the president of the ACBA, so I want to welcome you all and thank you all for coming. Y'all probably saw it on Facebook and checked it out, but we do kind of post a bunch of our events there, so you can check out us on Facebook or our website to see what else we're doing, because we've got a few other events coming up. At the end, I'll plug, I think we've got a Co-ops 101 event that I didn't have prepped, so we'll plug that at the end. But yeah, so thanks for coming to this history presentation. Henrik gave this presentation at NASCO to a room full of people not from Austin, so we thought that doing it through the ACBA, we could kind of get our local Austinites more information about our history. So he should be doing a great presentation. He works for college houses, lived at college houses. Really like it when people put their money where their mouth is and work and live in the co-op. So I think that's a great experience and context for giving this presentation. So I'll let Henrik take it away.
Hello, I'm Henrik, or you can call me Henny. I currently work for College House as the administrative coordinator. I handle leases and stuff like that, and the front desk person when there is a front desk. Currently there isn't. And I live here in my lovely home of Rosewood, and I have a few of my housemates in the room with me as a live audience. I prefer pronouns they, them, but he, she are acceptable. My experience with how this history is when I started working for the college houses in some capacity. I started as an intern, and they had a large piles and piles and piles of historical documents and minutes and stuff like that they needed to get rid of, because if you've ever been to the college house's office, it's really small for how many people work there. It's like a renovated 2 apartments of offices, and so it was a bit of beginning of the decluttering of that. But I read the documents as I was scanning them and uploading them, and so much of my information has come from that. But because I had that initial curiosity sparked from interning and archiving, I got to interview several people and met people throughout the time periods in the Austin History Co-op. So a lot of this is from our archive, but many of it is also for me informally and formally interviewing people. I originally did this presentation, as Ryan said, back in November. It is the same presentation. It was originally made by a few other people. It was done by Jim Jones predominantly. There are some kind of weirder things that doesn't sound like the language of the rest of the PowerPoint. I kept that there, and you can kind of tell by the italicized of who said it. But it has a lot more content than he had, because most of the presentation that he did was from his experience from being around Austin in the 60s and 70s, and lesser extent 80s around all this, and just coming back and forth. But I got to go to archives and read stuff from the library. So I'll kick it off and share my screen. I'd like to thank the ACBA for giving me this opportunity. So we're going to start with the first wave of cooperatives. For those who don't know, there are 3 major waves of cooperatives, at least in the US. The first wave was defined by everything before the 60s, essentially, but most co-ops came about around the Great Depression from the need of co-ops, and many co-ops throughout history have formed out of necessity of them. Some of the first co-ops in Texas were farming co-ops and electrical co-ops, and they were actually introduced by the New Deal. There is an electrical co-op here in Central Texas that was pushed for by LBJ himself when he was a congressman. I don't know the name of that electrical co-op at the moment. I don't know that much about electrical co-ops personally. But there are 2 main routes of housing co-ops in Austin. One starts at A&M, and the other one is the University Co-op bookstore here in Austin. So let's start at A&M. They were the first student housing co-ops in Texas, period. They were formed out of the necessity of people needing to have a place to live while going to college. Before the 90s, university was a lot more expensive, especially during the Great Depression. So the greatest cost of going to university was not working and dedicating your self for going to school and paying for housing. And housing was pretty expensive during the Great Depression, and particularly in Texas. Texas was greatly hit by the Dust Bowl in northern Texas and just the general like the South was poor. So a lot of people didn't have the opportunity to go to school. And housing co-ops are one of the ways that was done. There was a professor, faculty member at A&M who heard of the housing co-op model from Ann Arbor ICC system, and that's when the idea was put out there. And so A&M took it on themselves to start making co-ops from really cheaply made houses. Like they built the house in probably like a few months, and then shoved like 10 to 20 boys in there at a time. And they were a significantly cheaper option compared to the dorms. They were owned by A&M and weren't on campus, but they were managed by the people who lived there. There isn't that much information still around about what the actual structure of those houses were like. Those houses were typically filled by boys from the same county. It was very common that the families of the county and people who want to see like people actually leave that town that has been hit hard and try to make it out there. And so they like crowdfunded for housing. And so like one house in A&M would be paid to fill like by all of Hayes counties. And that house was called Hayes House. And so it'd be filled by students who were from Hayes County. There were some houses that weren't named that way. And those were the earlier houses when they just started making a few of them. You can see like an advertisement there. This is what the houses looked like. A&M doesn't look that much different now. Russell Hall was the first co-op, as you can see. I'll give some moment to read the quote from A&M Foundation. A&M does keep records that they had a co-ops, but they're long forgotten. And it's still like most people aren't aware that like our housing co-ops have like this continuation from them. They grew really fast because they were really popular. And also as the 30s went on, the Great Depression started to lessen. And so more and more people were able to go to school, but only really if they could live in a co-op. And so at the peak of it, they had 1,300 members, which is greater than all the student housing co-ops in Austin right now. And that made up about 23+% of the student body. And there are 52 houses, almost all of them just barely off of campus. But like A&M's not that big, so at the time, so off campus didn't mean that much. And eventually, as more federal programs started to come into fruition, and right before World War II happened, and the Great Depression was ending, they realized that people don't need to have this cheap housing, so they started to make dorms again, and slowly started to phase them out. Also, at the same time, is when they started making like kind of more military barrack style of housing, and that's like where the core in A&M comes about, and that kind of replaced co-ops. But by 1934, all of these colleges had co-ops from A&M like doing it in Texas. It was a very popular model. Almost none of these colleges still have co-ops or even exist. Most of these co-ops, I mean, most of these colleges, I think, are now other universities. And where the other route of housing co-ops came from in Austin is from the university bookstore, or the co-op, what it's called to now. It started in the very late 19th century. It was located in the UT main building, which wasn't the tower at the time. And then eventually it moved to 1918 to its current location, where it was the Drag. And it's like the only business that you would see that's still around from this time period. Try naming a business on the Drag that has been there for more than 15 years. That's what it looks like now-ish. It was modeled after the Harvard Co-op bookstore, which has a lot of co-op bookstores modeled after it. There are many university bookstores that are co-ops around the US that from the same time period. In the later 2000s, the university co-op decided to not be a co-op anymore, just to like rake in profits. And so they lost the cooperative model, but they got grandfathered into being allowed to be called a co-op because Texas is pretty stringent on who can be called a co-op. Technically, college houses and ICC, for example, aren't co-ops, they're cooperative housing. And like college houses may or may not have gotten sued in the past about calling ourselves a co-op. The first housing co-ops in Austin, it was started at UT when they saw that A&M adopted the model. And UT was very unique that it was always co-educational. Many universities at the time weren't co-educational, and men and women had to go to separate colleges, predominantly men because more men went to colleges. Way I kind of see it is that the UT was co-ed because Texas didn't want to make two different universities, so they just like stuck them together. The first house was Halstead Co-op, which is still the same Halstead Co-op in a way that College Houses currently has. It was named after the first like manager of it, like the trustee, I think what they called it, Jane Halstead. And it was located on East 126th Street, which means it was just past Speedway on 26th Street. There's a lot of dorms right there right now. And then a year later, the first men's co-op started at Campus Guild, and eventually New Guild Co-op was named after them. Here's a list of all of the women's cooperatives. The men's cooperatives and the women's cooperatives were totally different systems. I'll get to this more later, but the women's co-ops were run by like the dean of women's department, while men's co-ops are kind of just like more so on their own. And some of these co-ops eventually ended up being other houses, like Theodorn, I believe, became Helios. And they were in the same building, and there was a discontinuation of it being a co-op, but it was still the same building, and I don't know how much of like their policy continued. One notable one was there was an African-American only co-op in 1956 for when Brown versus Ward had like integration, but that co-op was originally here near Rosewood in East Austin, where Black Austinites were forced to live by redlining, but eventually they were able to move onto campus with the other co-ops. These were the men's co-ops at the time. More men's co-ops kind of came about in the 50s. Flaming is Helios. What were these houses like? They had kind of like older style frats and sororities. They had like a house mother or a house father because there needed to be a parental role. You weren't considered an adult yet. At the time, you weren't considered adult until about 21. So they were like college kids, and a lot of our like terminology still today kind of reflects that college students aren't adults. So UT was the parent, and then the UT like assigned a dorm, or you had to find someone to like be the parents. But for the women, it was assigned to them, and the houses had like house mother that was an employee of UT and did a lot of the cooking and clean, but not all of it. Later, when the co-ops were more intermingling, women did womanly labor. Like they would cook for the men co-ops, and the manly labor. The men would like fix stuff for the women's co-ops, and like with very like chaperoned like connection. Like they just didn't let the men go to the houses without like people being aware. They weren't there to really interact, and it was kind of like taboo to like have a man in the women's co-op without supervisor for any reason. But the women's co-ops did study together and have social events together. Oh, and I just was reminded that we can take questions too on the chat. There's a chat feature. You can put your name down so we can call upon you if you want to ask a question or share something. There are probably people here who know things that I don't know because you may have experienced these things. These houses were really under strict supervision. The members elected elected people to do administrative duties, kind of similar to how a lot of co-ops have officer positions. Men co-ops didn't really have that, but women did their own accounting at the time. And in some kind of weird backwards way, the women's co-ops were more autonomous than the men's co-ops because the women were expected to just do more in their lives. They collectivized the purchasing together and with men's co-ops. And they also like went to meetings with the University of Texas. Like there was like an organization within the University of Texas that kind of facilitated the interactions between the co-ops. Men had two different types of houses. They could either rent a house themselves and then employed a house mother, or that they rented a house from a house mother. It used to be a more commonplace where it was kind of similar to a boarding house where people could like rent a house together and there's someone who owns and runs the house, and like their job was to just like run that house for you. And so co-ops employed that, but many students had used that up in I think probably up until the 60s or 70s it was more common. Campus Guild, which was the biggest co-op at the time. Like we all slept in bunk beds. Like one room would have like 20 people sleeping in it. And then in 1939, ICC was organized. It was an informal organization at the time that was just the loose association of all the co-ops around. This is technically not the ICC Austin co-op, but I think them sharing a name means that there's some sort of like lineage to it. They had meetings, organized social events. They had people represent on the ICC council, which is similar to how ICC and college houses have board members that are elected by the houses. In 1969, ICC became the ICC that we know and love today. And currently, ICC has 200 members with 9 houses. This is some ICC people. This is a Campus Guild being built, despite what a lot of people from 21st Street will say. Campus Guild was the first built co-op in Austin. I don't know if it was the first built in the United States, but I highly doubt it. They built it themselves in West Campus around 26th Street and St. Gabriel. Pretty big. More pictures of it being built. And that's what it looked like from the outside. It had 80 members. It was the largest co-op until the ARC, aka Pearl Street. And it was also the only one owned. Here's a bit from the Daily Texan showing like here's the Campus Guild people live. ICC houses did not have AC, so at the time that co-ops, like UT co-ops having AC was a big deal. They must have been relatively fancy. There was a different like a zeitgeist to how co-ops viewed themselves. They were kind of more radical in their intention before, as you can see as by the Campus Guild's booklet. I'll give you all a moment to read that and like take it in because it kind of shows what like our predecessors, like where their heads were at when they were like participating in their house. Let us not forget. I haven't seen the original booklet myself. Maybe ICC may have it in their archives. The College Houses archives didn't have a lot of ICC stuff because ICC still exists, but College Houses had a lot of women's co-op stuff because the women's co-ops don't exist. And when a lot of organizations, like cooperative related organizations kind of go under, they tend to give their historical documents to college houses. Pre-World War II, there were 22 co-ops. Compared to the 10 after. Many of the men co-ops stopped existing because everyone went to World War II. And that's when a lot of co-ops died in Texas. A lot of universities that were mainly men only didn't have as many people going to university because they were going to college. And then when they were, going to war. And when they came back from war, they had the GI Bill, which gave them more ability to go to college. So they didn't need to live in a co-op for affordable housing a bit. But UT was able to press on because they had women who weren't going to work. There's Tulloch with a cute antidote for why their name is that. So all the co-ops we were talking about, except for Campus Guild, were on campus or like slightly north of campus. So we're going to start moving towards when they became focused in West Campus. So West Campus used to be called Wheatville, which is why Wheatsville is named Wheatsville. And there was a grocery store named Wheatsville after the neighborhood, so it's more indirect than that. And it was a Black neighborhood in the 19th century. A lot of different neighborhoods in West Austin, like west of the Capitol, west of downtown and west of campus were all like Black housing neighborhoods until they were eventually forced to leave multiple times. By the time that co-op started being in West Campus, it has been a middle-class white neighborhood for like a couple of decades. And as UT grew, so did West Campus, becoming a student hub for living. There was a major push for student living in West Campus starting in the 60s. I think a part of that was that there was starting to be more of a zeitgeist to students not living on campus, and also UT was growing and growing, and they at that time couldn't house everyone. But you still needed to have the university permission to live anywhere that wasn't on campus. And there are a lot of universities that still function that way. And now West Campus is one of the densest, if not the densest, living area in Austin. That picture there is still like, I think it's like 10 years old, and it's way bigger than that now. UT controlled where students lived until their early 70s because of the Vietnam War draft. You could be drafted as an 18-year-old, yet you weren't considered an adult. And so that's when the legal age of becoming an adult was 18. And then that's when the big upheaval from people not living on campus started, because people were able to really live wherever they wanted. The university still had to approve university housing though. Like if it was a dorm adjacent or something to that nature, UT was still involved, which will come into play later. Whitehall is the oldest continuously running co-op in Austin, if not in Texas. I'm extremely sure it's Texas. And it's still around. You can go to West Campus at 26th and San Antonio, and it's next to the Ruckus. It looks like at a time, nothing else in West Campus looks like this place anymore. Whitehall began as a UT women's co-op, and they were being forced to move / not exist. UT started getting bigger and bigger, and so they needed the land that the co-ops were on. And more times than not, UT wasn't really replacing those co-ops, and UT was being pretty uncooperative with interacting with the co-opers about what their needs were for land and housing. It was even to the point the relationship was so strained that UT wasn't sending officials to meet with the co-opers who were meeting in an official capacity at UT, because they were still like a part of the Dean of Women's department. So they decided to become independent and buy their own house. And then that's when they moved to West Campus. And they were one of the earlier independent co-ops, unless you consider all the men's co-ops, which were quasi-independent before them. And this was kind of there were co-ops on West Campus, but this is when they started really moving to West Campus. This is what the original house on campus looked like. December 1949. They had a fire in West Campus. It wasn't that bad because they were able to move back in like that same year. Is what the front of the house looked like. And originally was a women's only co-op, but now it is co-ed. I believe they've been co-ed for a few decades now. Really looks like a co-op. Responsibility, satisfactory performance of the girl, many be expected with complete confidence of the group. In 1952, the university built 3 buildings for 6 women's co-ops on campus. Those buildings are still there. They're just now like dorms. This is what a living room looked like at those co-ops. This is what they looked like in 2006. They're not a co-op. They weren't co-op. They weren't around in 2006, though. That's just the buildings, unfortunately. So 1957, there were nearly 400 members and 15 houses. Let's give y'all a moment to look at them. Almost all of them are like in the same area, but there's a few peppered like here and there. There were still intercooperative efforts in the 50s. There was a purchasing co-op established by co-ops and Greek life to buy food and supplies in bulk. Both of them, co-ops are more similar to Greek life at that time. They both diverged and are both different than they once were. And they tend to be chiller with each other at that time. And there was a service like this up until the 70s. And 60s and 70s is when the second wave of cooperatives began. The second wave of cooperative was defined by the kind of changing, like the societal changes across the world, where people started to want to organize outside of like their government and larger corporations, and people started to start food co-ops, housing co-ops, organizing protests, civil rights in the 1960s. And this one is less defined by necessity and more about intention, I would say. The non-Black co-ops were entirely white until the 50s, because that's when they were integrated. But co-ops most of them didn't racially integrate in the 60s. You can find minutes of houses that still exist where they voted on integration. Co-ops were some of, if not strictly, the first housing options in Austin to become co-ed and racially inclusive. So other co-ops in the United States, this focus was being inclusive. ICC and Arbor started in the 30s out of allowing people of all colors and races to like live together. College Access began in the 60s as a residential organization. And ICC was incorporated in the 60s and started to buy buildings in the 70s. And that's when the current way co-ops look started. And this is when it will start looking more familiar to us. And food co-ops started to begin all over the United States. And that is when the inklings of the 60s were the inklings of when Wheatsville was about to begin. I've heard a rumor that old Wheatsville, like the people who started Wheatsville were running a Wheatsville-like organization out of the co-op's kitchens in West Campus. This was a house in the West Lynn area that is north of West Campus. There currently aren't any co-ops there, unless you consider the Pink Palace a co-op. I didn't read anything about this house in particular. This is a Jim Jones leftover. He must have experienced this house. In the late 60s, land developers started to buy up a lot of the property in West Campus. Before that, a lot of the property was owned by churches or just like individual homeowners. And then this was when big developers started getting involved and like buying up entire blocks. And this is when the University Towers started to be built. If you didn't know, the University Towers is being torn down as we speak. Oh yeah, it's totally imploded now. And so co-ops and these developers started buying up land in this area all at the same time, and it was competitive. And things started to change when UT implemented a shuttle bus system, so you didn't have to live on or next to campus to go to UT, and that's when Riverside started becoming students, and Riverside used to be more student heavy than it is now. When I moved to Austin in 2013, Riverside was like more known for student housing than it is now. And then that made the real estate market bottom out in West Campus, which was great for co-ops because it means we can buy them cheaper. That's when ICC started to begin purchasing this property. They borrowed money from women's co-ops to put a down payment on their first house, Holloway House, which was named after their attorney. And the Campus Guild caught on fire. Jim Jones said it was probably arson. It was probably arson because it was built really badly. It was falling apart already at this time, and it would have been more easy for them to sell it as a burnt down building, I guess, than just a bad building. and they sold the house and they gave it to ICC because they weren't a part of ICC yet. And then ICC used that money to form New Guild to be like the sole continuation of it. That's New Guild. All the pictures of these houses were from the Jim Jones, or most of the pictures from the houses are from the Jim Jones presentation in 2006. So it's interesting to see like how everything looked just in 2006, 14 years ago. And then they bought Seneca, or at the time Seneca Falls, and then it was called Varsity at that time. There was like a more connection to UT at the time, so like houses were named like vaguely after football-y things. I'm glad it's not called Varsity anymore. ICC bought French House. It was then called Ramshorn. I heard that when French House started, it was started by the French department, and like a French professor lived there. And they were only like, it was people lived there to speak French with each other outside of class. At dinners, they were only allowed to speak French. I don't know how long they kept that up though, because I don't know anyone at ICC who speaks French at the moment. And then they bought Helios, Lean Co-op. Never seen Helios. It's one of the prettiest co-ops ever. And a little bit after, they bought Royal, which was named after the football coach, and it was sold by a city council member who needed money to finance their campaign, and they lost. But ICC got Royal out of that. And Royal is not in West Campus, it's in Judges Hill. So just like barely on the other side of MLK. Loch Lomond was purchased by ICC to be in Riverside because that's when where a bunch of students were living. I've heard of two other co-ops named Loch Lomond. I don't know why it's really popular for co-op names. And then a little bit after that, Arrakis was bought from, again, University Village, which was one of the big developers. One of the most important figures in ICC's revolution was Ernie Eden, shown at the NASPA conference in 1971. I don't particularly know the details about Ernie Eden outside that I see his name dropped in a lot of things. He was just involved in a lot of organizations. I'm sure it was more than just that. And then we're going to move to College Houses. College Houses was founded in 1964 by a student group who wanted to have a living situation outside of UT that was for education. These people were very studious students and didn't want to just learn from UT. They wanted to learn from each other, from ground students, from professors in a non-UT like way. And there was also like professors, they got on board with this. A lot of these people were in student government. Like they were I don't know if they were so much as like the president, but they were like officers of the student council. And it took UT some convincing to allow this because it was radical in that women and men would be living on the same property together, and so they had like a house mother and a house like father, and they were each two professors who were married to each other from UT campus. The Tamingas were the professors' names. They really wanted this community to emphasize education and also politics to a lesser extent and greater extent as the Vietnam War started and picked up on. I remember being told that there was a College House member in their late 60s who went to the Vietnam War and he got drafted in the Vietnam War and died. And that was a pretty big moment for people in the house. College House was initially funded by a psychology grant because it was considered a social experiment to have students and faculty living together off campus. And they got that funding for 4 years. The first 2 years they got full funding, and then they got like weaned off of it because I don't think they were going to fund college houses for forever. And they had one single staff member who worked in the kitchen. Their name was Alice. For anyone who lived in college houses, if you ever had the Alice labor position, it's named after this person. College House has hosted many events, like off-campus events, not just for themselves, but they had people do their prepare for their dissertation, people to do like who did the research and presented it at college houses, and it was meant. And like a lot of these events were just like to intermingle like intellectuals together. And before they were a co-op, because they weren't a co-op yet, the closest thing they had to a labor system was a tutoring system, and everyone had to like rotate being a tutor with each other. And there was like a tutoring time between, I think, 6 and 8. And the rent became more expensive because all of the developers started buying property in 1968. And they lost their grant funding, so that's when they decided to become a co-op. They were aware of co-ops because of ICC and the UT women's cooperatives. So they had to fire Alice, unfortunately, and do the labor that Alice did, which was cooking and cleaning. And they were only able to stay there until 1968, 69, and then they had to move houses, and they moved several different houses in West Campus along Rio Grande Street between 24th and 21st Street. They almost like were just hopping from the next door to the next door to the next door, trying to get the cheaper rent. And sometimes they would have to rent more than one house right next to each other so they can have enough people to live there. At the same time, there were other co-ops starting to form that were claiming College House. One was called College House Rio Grande, even though it wasn't on Rio Grande. And they were what people may associate with 21st Street now, but at that time, they were politically radical, a party fueled house, and OG College House distanced themselves because UT was like, why does this place exist? And like even was like threatening all college houses affiliated things to be shut down because of this one house. But now College Houses, I think, does claim them as a part of us. They still existed for a while after college houses started existing. What I believe was Stonehenge Co-op, but the history is really fuzzy. There's a lot of not known history because there are a lot of co-ops that formed for a year or two, totally independent of the other co-ops, and then stopped to exist, or they kept switching houses. And CH, as I said earlier, CH rented several different buildings, and they did that up until 1971. And 1971 is when they found their permanent home at the Ark, which is also known as the Purple. It was called Ark because it was viewed as like this was how they were going to get a bunch of co-ops off the ground. Pearl, and that's where they did plan a lot of things with Pearl. The student leadership of College House applied for a HUD loan at the time in the 70s. Was probably one of the best times for federal programs in the United States history. There was the most money allocated to federal funding for projects such as housing, and so College Houses applied for student housing to exist. HUD doesn't do this anymore, and debatably HUD barely does anything compared to what they did at this time. So they were able to get a HUD loan to buy Pearl, buy Opsis, and to buy the 6 properties that 21st Street took and bulldoze those houses and build 21st Street. So it was millions of dollars to get this loan, and it took a couple of years to get it. UT had to approve of it, and UT says they don't approve of any off-campus housing. And so there was like this back and forth, like years-long back and forth between HUD and UT and College House, particularly just like the officers of College House. And the thing that they had to settle on is UT says they don't not approve of it, and that was enough to get home to fund us. And this was the last project that HUD would fund for co-ops in the United States. And and there was a similar happening in Canada at the time. Here's Pearl, also known as the Ark. This is in 2006. That is what it looked like before College House bought it. It was a luxury women's dormitory. At the time, in the 50s, there was like a trend of like labeling your housing luxury housing or luxury dorms. It may seem really vague and unfamiliar to us now. Farrah Fawcett lived here, as Pearl really likes to claim. Opsis, originally known as Ark Apartments. It was said that we bought it for $1. They were owned by the same property people, and they really just wanted to get it out of West Campus because it was like volatile. And we didn't want the ops just because we didn't see how apartments could be co-ops like they were at Penn, so they were thrown in with the purchase of Pearl for $1. At least so is said. And 21st Street was built. This is what it looked like a year after opening, or 2 years after opening. When it opened, it looked a lot worse. We tried to buy this property. If you're familiar with the Hotel Ella, that was a co-op briefly for a year or two, which is right next to 21st Street at this time. It was known as Laurel House, and we got outbid for it. It's really hard to buy a property if you're using federal funding to buy it or any kind of outside funding, because you'll get the government to say, yes, I'll give you this much money for it, and then a private donor will just outbid you, and then you have to ask again for more money, but by that time they're probably going to sell the property, and that's what happened. The 21st Street building project was meant to include solar energy for heating and cooling, but in the 70s solar power wasn't good yet, and 21st Street doesn't use solar energy now because it was so much of a hassle, and we'll go into the details of that later. When 21st Street opened up, Jake Pickle spoke at the grand opening, same person that the Pickle Research Center is named after. I'm gonna actually take this moment to say that 21st Street's opening was very stressful on college houses. It was opened several months late. The construction company was incompetent. People had to stay in a hotel for that time period. Some people had to stay with friends, and they were able to maintain most people and moving in November. But unfortunately, still wasn't really done, and people still had to finish things, and it was muddy and it was awful, and people started living in 21st Street before water and electricity was even running there. And in the original system they didn't have the solar panels up. So they had to either have hot water in the kitchen or hot water for the bathrooms. So there was times for which they planned hot water for this, hot water for that. Really janky. Mike McCone was the person that did most of the HUD work from what I can tell. His name is on all the letters. And he's now a consultant for all major development in West Campus. No one knows code of West Campus like Mike McCone does. And he's consulted so much so that city officials will tell you to talk to him about things. This is 21st Street in the mid-70s. I may have a slight focus on 21st Street because I lived for 21st Street, and they do have an interesting history, and they really like their own history. 21st Street in 2006. Kind of what it looked like when I moved in. This statue was in memorandum of a member who died cleaning or attending to the solar panels. There was a wasp or a bee, and they in a panic fell off the building, and that was one of the reasons why they took away solar panels, because it was a dangerous thing for member labor to do. Also, it provided, I think, only hot water sometimes. In 1974, Jim Jones became the first staff person of college houses. And then the next house that was related to college houses was Laurel House, which is independently founded by members at the Arc and 21st Street. And they rented out what is now Taos. And that's an old sketch of Taos. That's what it looked like when it was the A-Bar Hotel in the 40s. And then Laurel, it was becoming too expensive, so Laurel had to move, and with college houses helping, they were able to secure an apartment building that is currently where Super Co-op is, on the corner, near the corner of San Antonio, Oasis Street and MLK. And it was two buildings, I believe, with a courtyard in between them. And it kind of looked like a hotel. That's what Laurel House looked like in 2006, right before Super Co-op was built. And there were many independent co-ops that spun off, like Laurel House did, Stonehenge Co-op, Nexus Co-op, and they all looked kind of the same because many houses looked at that time looked like that in West Campus. Almost all of those buildings were going away really soon. When I moved to West Campus, a lot of these buildings were still here, but a lot of them are now gone. This house, which is near Pluckers on 23rd Street. Oh, it is now gone too. But it was once a co-op. And 1976 is when Wheatsville started. It started on Lamar and then later moved to Guad. And the third of the capital was started by college houses. College houses had like a share of Wheatsville. If not, I don't think we still do, but we once did. It was random to come across that in our records. This is what the original store looked like in Lamar. And there was carpet. In 1977, there was a major symposium called Wind Through the Pines. It was kind of like NASCO Institute, but here in Austin. Austin still is one of the major hubs of co-ops, and so it makes sense for Austin to have another like similar thing, and NASCO helped sponsor it. There's a lot of memorabilia from here. That's the 21st Street Commons when it had carpet. Most of this is left over from Jim Jones's presentation. I assume he was there. And the whole symposium was hosted at 21st Street. And apparently it was an amazing time. Here's a picture of Ernie Eden and Jerry Voorhees walking up the stairs to the Commons. But from that, they started a newsletter that was a continuation of that event, and that newsletter ran until I believe the late 80s or mid 80s. And it was almost like having a co-op newspaper in Austin. And this credit union started for members of co-ops in Austin. It wasn't until I believe the 90s where you had to, or maybe it was the 2000s, that credit unions had to have especially like you had to be a part of something to be a part of a credit union. Now credit unions can be totally open to anyone, but for whatever reason there was a restriction on who can use them, probably because they're just superior to banks. But there was one started for co-opers here. The office was in Wheatsville. And then shortly after, the National Cooperative Bank was formed by the Congress, and that's when Sunflower was started by a group of ICC members. And Sunflower is still around. I believe it's like 10 members. And then people from ICC and college houses wanted to start a land trust, but for co-op specifically, and it ran out of the college house's office. And it was like a land trust plus, like it was meant for more general development of community and to promote cooperative growth. One of the things they worked on was a RV park co-op, which may sound kind of familiar to people at Chia now. From my understanding, the initial trying to start co-ops didn't work out too well because they ended up trying to get people who didn't know much about co-ops to get interested in co-ops. And so they went to more just general like community housing projects, and they eventually became Foundation Communities, which is now one of the largest nonprofits for affordable housing and low income housing in Austin now. You probably have seen their buildings. ICC also started to expand, and that's when they bought HOC. And they traded out Holloway House, so to me that means they sold it. And then the early 80s, ITC bought 3 apartment buildings. As this like article says, it really expanded their membership. These apartment buildings, though, didn't last long, unfortunately. That's what they look like. Had another pool. And college houses bought Taos at that time, which was the original Laurel House. And Taos is still there today. Picture of their dining room. Them in their rooms. They still have this carpet in some of the rooms. The Wind Through the Pines education project became the Austin Co-op Link, and that's when like the newsletter continued, and they were just like a general like an organization for connecting different co-op organizations, mostly ICC college houses, Wheatsville, and then the independent houses that were around. And disaster struck because the 80s saw a great recession, and the housing market bottomed out all over the United States, but particularly in West Campus. The demand for housing was lower, and so prices of land really went down and rent went down, and co-ops have a difficult time with keeping up with rent of other places. So when rent ever got cheap everywhere else in West Campus, college houses couldn't afford to get any cheaper at that time. And ICC weren't able to do that. So there was more competition, so to speak, and so people weren't living in co-ops for necessity anymore. It was only people who wanted to live in a community. And occupancy for ICC and college houses went really low. It was the worst time period in both organizations' histories, and we lost. ICC lost those apartments and many other houses in ICC. Like from this bottoming out is when the more so stable configuration of what ICC houses like solidified. There was a lot of turnover in staff and membership, and I think just involvement in co-ops. And so the Austin Co-op Link also disbanded, and just a lot of general inter-cooperative things like disbanded. The 80s were rough. In the 80s, you can work around that time, you can work a part-time job in the summer and then have that pay for your housing and school over the fall, spring semesters. And NASCO Properties formed out of necessity of HOC needing help from it catching on fire. HOC caught on fire and needed repairs, but ICC wasn't in any position to fix it at the time because ICC and college houses were reeling from the low occupancy. And so NASCO Properties stepped up and existed. And NASCO Properties still exists and is highly successful. Shout out to you, NASCO Properties. Daniel Miller's in the call. So college houses had to do some financial finagling and like change their mortgage payments, like get a different loan provider so they cannot lose Taos. And we ended up not losing Taos, but we almost did. And that would have changed the history of college houses because currently we use Taos as our like mortgage for super co-op. Wheatsville forgot its roots to college house and ICC. There used to be much more of a connection between the groups. There's still there is a connection between them now, but in the late 1990s, there was another wave of UT women's co-ops being kicked off the campus so they can keep building dorms. This is when they built King Solving, and like King Solving was built on top of a bunch of women's co-ops. Also, there was a famous lawsuit at UT for men wanting to live in the women's co-ops because there wasn't a male equivalent at UT, and so they then made them co-ed. And as you can imagine, the men who sued UT to live in the women's co-ops didn't necessarily create the best environment, and so they suffered great occupancy issues and just like went away because people didn't want to live there. And many of them were able to combine to buy, like the people who didn't want to live on campus anymore and also just tired of dealing with UT, did what Whitehall did in the 50s, but again in the 2000s. And they bought the third incarnation of Halstead, which is across University Towers. This building doesn't exist anymore. It's between like 24th and 25th Street on Pearl Street. And also, Iraq has had a fire. The story goes, is that there was a toaster that was really janky, and it was like it wouldn't turn off on its own, and it was over winter when a lot of people weren't there, and someone forgot to turn the toaster off, and it caught the place on fire. So Ken in College House uses this opportunity to say, like, this is why you like don't keep janky equipment. Like when you live with a lot of people, there's a reason to just like buy new things, because that's how your house catches on fire. ICC still, like, in their office has the toaster that did this. As someone told I was told that last time I gave this presentation. I haven't seen the toaster. I swear there's only like 4 fires in this history. Actually 5. And it was rebuilt and repainted and looks a lot nice. A lot nice, really nice. When I'm gonna take this time to plug in a bit of my own experience with co-ops. When I moved into 21st Street, co-ops became pretty queer. There are a lot of queer people in co-ops. And as I continue to live in Austin, it becomes even more true. You can see in this picture, there are pride flags there. Sometime in 2000s, it became really friendly towards queer people. I don't know quite what the history in ICC and college houses was. I did know that they had queer people living there. There's a question about auto-muting everyone else. I'm not the host. Can Ryan Nill do that? He's on it. Thank you. So Halstead wasn't doing well. It's really hard for people to buy a property and then manage it without prior experience. That they had like a lot of difficulties with just operating the house, and they had low occupancy, and that's when college houses bought it, and that's when it entered our system. But we only had it briefly before we sold it to build Super Co-op, and then that's when Halstead moved to Super Co-op, to the top of it. Halstead was still a women's only co-op when we had it. Before it moved to Super Co-op, and the original intentions of it being in Super Co-op was to maintain being a women's co-op, which is why if you ever are in Super Co-op, Halstead isn't attached to the other 2 houses. Like Laurel and Oasis are attached to each other, but Halstead isn't. And that was because the original intention was that, but they ended up not doing that because it was, I've heard different reasons, but I think the main reason that it's kind of against fair housing, and college houses would then more expected to be under fair housing at this time because we received city funding to build Super Co-op. I'll go into that in a moment. And in the late 90s, ICC purchased Eden House and was formerly a co-op, an independent co-op before. Eden 2006. In the early 2000s, there were former college houses and ICC people who wanted to start non-student co-op housing. There wasn't many options for non-student co-op housing, and all of the non-student co-op houses, or most of the non-student co-op houses, were in West Campus, and West Campus isn't the greatest to live in when you're not a student. When I moved into 21st Street, there were 3 non-student co-ops within like walking distance of 21st Street, but they still had a lot of students live there. And Chia, or this, go back to the original point. This is when Sasona Co-op started in 2002. It's like the only co-op outside of Sunflower that are south of the river in Austin. What Sasona looks like. Sasona had to really fight to exist here. The neighbors didn't want a bunch of people living in the small houses, and a lot of people's association, a lot of the association with co-ops was like the rowdy UT co-ops, and so there was so much like upheaval against it. But once people were actually living there, no one cared. They were fine neighbors. And now we have a Super Co-op in Austin. Love this layover from Jim Jones. Ooh, I have a couple of comments I'll read out. Danny Miller said Chia is a community housing expansion of Austin. I'll blame Jim. It's a correction to the slide. And Tucker saying Eden was previously called the Stag in the 60s and later Halcyon before becoming Eden. The Stag shows up in the film Tower since it's one of the people who helped save people during the Tower shooting lived in Halcyon. Oh, thank you for that tidbit. If anyone's seen Slacker, Royals in Slacker. College houses was encouraged by the city and land developers to increase the population density of West Campus because West Campus was starting to become not big enough in terms of how huge UT was becoming. And so this is when the period of like a lot of high rises were starting to be built. I've heard, though I have no proof of this, was that there was like a threat of eminent domain of Laurel House to build something if we didn't act. And so we got city funding, UNO city funding, to help provide the initial funding to buy Super Co-op. The UNO overlay is a city planning of West Campus that like issues like how high and tall something can be and other things, and it has a way to capture money from developers who aren't providing affordable housing to then give to affordable housing organizations. ICC and college houses are only affordable housing organizations at West Campus. So it's basically like a co-op fund. And Mike McCone had a lot to do with that, the person I mentioned earlier who was a developer of it. He pushed for that. And the first purchasing of that fund was Super Co-op. And we had to sell Housestead to help fund the project and put House on as collateral. And why was a super? It had 3 houses in it. It was kind of called Super Co-op fittingly, and then the name stuck. It was a lot of it was a lot of members saying what they want in Super Co-op. So Super Co-op is really weird building. Like no 2 rooms are alike or hardly alike because they were trying to mimic what 21st Street was like. But the rooms aren't unique in 21st Street. They're only unique because of what people did to those rooms. So there's like some really weirdly shaped rooms that like there's like an L-shaped room where it's like thin 2 hallways making 1 room. And I heard, and there's supposedly was supposed to be a 6th floor part of it, but the construction company ran out of money, and so they had to consolidate an Oasis to be 1 floor. And there's 5 stories of housing and 2 parking levels. Here's it being constructed. At the time, we were talking to ICC to possibly use Helios's land to also build Super Co-op, and there was serious planning about literally picking up Helios and moving it to next to Pearl, where Arc Park is. Arc Park is owned by college houses, and it's just a park for co-ops. And there are a lot of plans on how to do that, but that would have costed an absurd amount of money. And around the same time, there was a big like fight in Austin because Helios was going to be eminent domain. There was something where Helios was being forced to be bought up, and then that's when Helios got a historical land designation, and ICC and college houses worked on getting it to be an historical land designation so nothing would happen to it. And also that's why we couldn't move it, because once it got historical land designation, it's a nightmare. This is pre-people moving in for Super Co-op. Oh, Danny Miller's. A few co-ops have moved buildings to save them and take them in co-ops, and it was always way more than people thought it would be, and they said it wouldn't do it again. And the next big major development was Chia expanding to Laurel Union Co-op, which is their 2nd house. It's in North Austin beyond Anderson. Why did they choose those colors for Super Co-op, Rob? I actually assume that I bet there was a committee in college houses of people like doing the interior decorating, and they thought like green was co-op-y, but like too dark of green would have been too much. But that's just a guess. Uh, 2011 is when Rosewood was founded. That's where I live. It was founded by former ICC people. We didn't buy it. We rented. Our landlord wanted to rent to a co-op because it was an easy way to deal with a big property. Roots was founded around this time too. I don't know that much about Roots outside that I've known that they've existed for a while. They used to be in North Austin near University Hills, I believe, and now they're in South Austin. Eastside Treehouse. It also came about around this time. I don't know the specific time period. It is in Cherrywood. It looks it looks like a treehouse, which is why it's called Treehouse. And some people, there's a lot of confusion because 21st Street used to be called Treehouse Co-op too. And when I've heard people talk about Treehouse Co-op and they meant 21st Street, and I've heard people talk about Treehouse Co-op and they meant Treehouse. Danny Miller says Roots still exists south of Stansney. Definite co-op vibe. There's some other houses. Hardy House. We have a couple of Hardy House people in the chat. Concordia Co-op, which was founded 2 years ago. It was in the corpse of Marjorie Daw. It's also in Cherrywood. It's a few blocks from Treehouse. I haven't been to it yet, but I want to. And there are others. There are always lots of co-ops that fly under the radar. There are some people who came by Rosewood asking about how our labor system worked, and there are some people who were like said that lived in a co-op in North Austin that wasn't anything we heard of before. And there's always ones that pop up briefly that are rented. And for all I know, that there could be a co-op that has run for a couple of decades in Austin and just haven't heard of it yet. There used to be more independent co-ops in West Campus when I moved there. There was like House of Guys, there was Marjorie Daw, there was German House. But eventually the West Campus became way too expensive to rent property. None of them own their own property. That's the end of my presentation. I'd like to take this time to do questions. Are there age restrictions to becoming a member, or is it open to all students? So for college houses and ICC, they're open to all students. We can't discriminate on age because it's against fair housing laws. And then the other co-ops are not student co-ops.
Henrik, do you have any insights from what you learned about co-ops and the Depression and how it might apply to our current situation? Or prior crisis periods? How about, let's just reframe that a little bit.
Yeah, so I would say that there actually may be a fourth wave of co-ops that started from the Great Recession in the 2000s, and we may still be in that period. There were a lot of co-ops founded and similar organizations from the Occupy movement and a lot of other people organizing around the time. We may need more time to see what that would look like to see if there was a significant impact, but I suspect that there may be. But if necessity breeds co-ops in this time period we're currently in, if this pandemic caused recession that we're in, theoretically would have more people looking for housing co-ops and other kinds of co-ops because they have to. And hopefully we're here to help them. I have a question for my house. Was Campus Guild a house for law students? Not that I heard of. I don't think any of outside of like being specific for majors, none of the student housing co-ops were that specific for any group. The most exceptionist one I can think of is like Opsis prefers grad students, but they're still not grad students exclusive. On the flip side, co-ops are struggling with the fact that they're community housing when they're all trying to avoid community. So who'd to say what happened after that? Yeah, it is kind of weird to like live with a bunch of people when a pandemic's going on. That's something that our co-op here had to like think about, and also college houses had to think about. Oh, what other cities have many co-ops or more co-ops as Austin? The immediate ones I can think of are around the Bay Area and San Francisco. There's a lot of housing co-ops there. Berkeley has the biggest student co-op organization in the United States. Ann Arbor is the second biggest. Their answer in Ann Arbor. Madison. there's a lot of university towns that that also just have co-ops too. Surprisingly, like major cities tend to not have that many co-ops. Ithaca, New York has several. Canada and Toronto, Waterloo have a lot of co-ops. And best I can think, like New York has a lot of housing co-ops, but they're not what we would think of as housing co-ops. They're kind of like more of like condos, because condos in a way are kind of cooperative in that they're one big building owned by several people. Danny Miller says Canada has different housing and financial laws. They have a bunch of cities with 500 plus bads of co-ops. Yeah, like from my Canadian co-opper friends, a lot of houses don't have labor, and a lot of people will die on the hill that if your co-op doesn't have labor, then it's not a co-op. I tend to be in that camp, but not fully in that camp. Most of Ontario and some other provinces. Fun fact, in Canada, there are remote areas in Canada where they didn't have a local government for a long time, and so the farmer co-ops that they formed were the closest thing to local governments, which eventually became the local governments.
That sounds cool.
Because like it was like a representative body of the people who lived there, so it just incorporated. Like I guess Canada just deemed it as the official like ruling body. What makes certain North American cities, such as popular places, establish co-ops? In your opinion, radical left phobia seems antithetical to their establishment in theory. A part of it is housing zoning laws. Like Boulder, Colorado has some co-ops, but they had to fight really hard to be officially recognized. A lot of places have that. You can only have a few people who aren't related who can live together, and also it's some places zoning laws made it be that like a co-op, if a co-op are renting from it, that means it's like a business more adjacent thing or a higher density of family thing. So depending on how friendly city laws are, they would be more prone to. I know New York has like a department that helps promote co-ops, like to be more, this is more so in the worker co-op camp, but it really depends on city friendly. And also it depends on the population. Austin has so many co-ops because it is like it's like a mecca in the South of like different like cultures and political ideologies. It isn't just the rest of conservativeness that the rest of the South is. Not that co-ops are necessarily like not conservative, because I imagine out there are like libertarian and conservative co-opers. Because I've met many libertarian co-opers who believe in co-ops because they're libertarian and right-wing libertarian, not like left libertarian. Actually, and also with left phobia for co-ops, in the third wave of co-ops, which I kind of skimmed over in their presentation, the third wave of co-ops is from the 80s, and it's out of like fiscal responsibility that we are like combine our businesses together. And those co-ops started at that time tend to like value like the money aspect of it and really like distance themselves from the rest of the cooperative movement. Even so much so that many co-ops that were previously co-ops removed co-op from their name, just so they like look less leftist. Now there's less of an association like leftism in co-ops now from that, and also people intentionally making the space more like politically inclusive. Have any other questions? What about senior housing co-ops? I think when it comes to like housing for seniors, co-housing tends to be preferred. I don't know too much about this, and I imagine someone in the chat definitely does. I've heard that there is a boomer co-op in Austin or starting. I don't know the details about it. For example,
I can speak to that a little bit. So I know that senior co-ops are, a relatively well-established thing in this country. I found a senior co-op website once that listed over 100 different senior co-ops, but none in Texas. I made sure to check. So they're out there. I tend to think that like I kind of have this like working theory that co-ops are good options for people that don't have a lot of power in society. So I think that's why maybe like students and seniors can kind of like band together to get some kind of like power in society. So that's just kind of like a working theory. Someone else can maybe go and test that a little bit harder. But so for the Boomers Co-op, explicitly, they've been trying to start a co-op in town at different kind of sites for a few years now. Right now, they're looking at the Crestview station, the Austin Energy site across the street from the Crestview station where Black Star is. And before the pandemic started, they seem to have like a good relationship with the developer, and that seems to be a project that is moving along. I'm not really sure what's going on now that everything has gone sideways in society.
In the chat, the towers on Park Lane in San Antonio is the senior co-op.
Oh, cool. Must be a new one. I did this several years ago, like 5 years ago when I did the research, or just didn't include it, which could also be fair.
Now, a lot of co-ops don't make their presence known anywhere, like nowhere on internet. Like there's a lot they're flying under the radar. What do you think are the prospects in cooperative housing for cooperative housing expansion in Austin and elsewhere currently? Ryan, would you be able to answer that better than me?
Sure. So one of the things that the ACBA advocacy group works on a lot is the zoning code, because we're currently doing a code rewrite in Austin. So I think a lot of it is up in the air and depends on what is going to be the result of that code rewrite. So I will say, like, if y'all are interested, if you can drop your email addresses in the chat, we can add y'all to the email list for that group if that's something you're interested in learning more about and working on. And there was a project that was mentioned at the beginning that is a CHIA project, which is it's a ROC USA, which stands for Resident-Owned Communities, and they do mobile home co-op conversions where mobile home communities buy the land. And I'm the program manager for that. So I'm currently working on converting a park to a co-op. And that's a well-funded program. So the idea is that we could have a bunch of these kind of just in the pipeline for quite a while. So I think right now, in my opinion, that's the most likely source of co-op expansion, just because we've got the funding and the resource behind it, and so we could be doing, like several a year. So I think that's a really cool opportunity. And then there are some folks in town. We have another committee that is looking at how to develop more of what we think of as traditional co-ops in Austin. So like the group houses and the apartments, like you've seen in this presentation. And that is a work in progress, and that's another committee that we have that y'all could join.
Yeah, I've heard separately. I've heard that there's a lot since Austin's a tech hub. There's a lot of tech people who are interested in co-ops. So maybe the changing demographics of Austin also make non-student co-ops be more popular. We have a few more questions here. Do you ever hear any stories or find evidence of rivalry/disagreement between co-ops and frat sororities that went beyond just bad mouthing? No, they're kind of just like cats who hiss at each other. I've heard of some co-opers pulling pranks on frats and sororities, but they're very minor, and I've never heard of frats or sororities ever acknowledging co-ops. The most interaction I've ever heard of between them is that typically when frats get really bad, the cops like ramp up their like activity in West Campus, which also means that affects the college co-ops too, because they also are the other other people who are having parties. But from my understanding, police tend to hate frats and sororities more than co-ops, oddly enough. Historically speaking. Did you know of any established international ties with cooperative groups or agencies in different continents, like Global NASCAR or something? Yes, the ICC, I'm trying to remember their name. The ICA. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I've heard that ICA represents like is an NGO that represents more people than any other NGO on earth. And they're definitely really active. They're like, I'm not super familiar with how international co-op organization works, but they have the members have representatives and go to meetings, and they meet all over the world. I've met a few ICA people. Are there other international organizations? I think there are for specific industries. International Co-op Alliance is what ICA stands for. And is there like a Facebook group nationwide? No, I know that NASCO has like a Slack for co-opers. Some co-opers stole a frat letter once, like the big wooden thing from a yard. My co-op stole like a bunch of tables from a frat that went away. They were like gone, and they just looted the building. I think they still have like a couple of those tables. Task members used to drop water balloons over the rail of the sun deck at frat boys yelling slogans about non-consensual fluids. Oh yeah, Taos is unfortunately located across one of the worst frats possible, and they're really loud. Was it Fiji? Yeah, it was. Oh, another organization's Clusa. Sorry, I'm just going down the chat, so we're popping in between our different questions, just hanging out. Are there any other questions before we end this call? There is a link to the NASCO Co-op Slack posted.
Cool. Well, I guess it sounds like the questions are out. So I want to thank Henrik for giving this presentation. Remind y'all that that ACBA has a Facebook group. And like I mentioned, we got those email lists if you want to get involved. So I'll make sure to keep this meeting going a little bit longer. So if people want to drop a line, we can do that a little bit afterwards. Other ways that you can support other than volunteering, we have a donation club called the Cooperation Club. So if y'all are some of the lucky few who manage to have a remote job and keep it, and you have a little bit of extra and want to support, you can go to acba.coop and click on the support link, and you can donate. Also, if you're part of a co-op and you're not a member of the ACBA, you should encourage your co-op to become a member of the ACBA. So yeah, I want to thank everyone for coming.
It's nice hanging out, y'all. Thank you for your time.
All right, bye.